The sorrel mare bucked and twisted like a living tornado, her copper coat gleaming with sweat under the Arizona sun. And 23-year-old Josephine Harper watched from the corral fence as 14 cowboys circled the beast, none of them fool enough to try climbing on her back again after what she had done to the last man who dared. Fort McDowell in the summer of 1876 was a place where dust settled into everything, where the Verde River offered the only respite from the relentless heat, and where men gathered to prove themselves against animals that refused to be broken. Josephine had ridden in 3 days prior with her father's freight wagon, delivering supplies to the military post and the scattered ranches that dotted the territory. She had watched these same cowboys attempt to break this same horse for 2 days now, and not one of them had lasted more than 8 seconds. The mare was beautiful in her fury, all fire and spirit, her red coat catching the light like burnished copper. She had been captured from a wild herd running through the Salt River Valley, and whoever had thought to tame her had severely underestimated what lived in her heart. Josephine understood that spirit, felt it echoing in her own chest as she watched the animal refuse every attempt to dominate her. "That horse is going to kill someone," her father said, coming to stand beside her at the fence. Thomas Harper was a weathered man of 52, his face lined from years of hauling freight across the Arizona territory. "They should let her go." "They will not," Josephine said quietly. "Men like that cannot stand to see something wild remain free." Her father glanced at her, something sad moving behind his eyes. He knew his daughter carried that same wildness, had watched her chafe against the expectations placed on women in this harsh land. She could drive a freight wagon as well as any man, could shoot straighter than most, and had a way with horses that bordered on uncanny. But she was 23 now, unmarried, and the whispers followed her wherever they went. "Maybe you should head back to the wagon," Thomas suggested, not because he thought she needed protecting, but because he saw the way some of the cowboys were starting to notice her standing there. "In a moment," Josephine said, unable to tear her eyes from the sorrel mare. The horse had stopped her frantic movement now, standing in the center of the corral with her sides heaving, nostrils flared wide. The 14 cowboys maintained their distance, spread around the fence line like wary sentinels. One of them, a tall man with a cruel mouth, picked up a coiled rope and started forward. "That is enough, McCready," called another voice, and Josephine's attention shifted to a man who had been standing in the shadow of the stable. He stepped into the sunlight now, and she felt her breath catch slightly in her throat. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of strong coffee. He moved with an easy confidence, not the swagger of the other cowboys, but something quieter and more certain. His clothes marked him as a working ranch hand, worn but well-maintained, and he wore no gun on his hip, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. "The boss said break her," McCready responded, not lowering the rope. "The boss said see if she could be broke," the dark-haired man corrected. "There is a difference. This mare has spirit, not meanness. Beating it out of her is not going to work. You think you can do better, Brennan." So that was his name. Brennan, something with an I surname, Josephine would learn later. She watched as he approached the fence, his movements slow and deliberate, and she saw the mare's ears flick toward him, tracking his position. "I think she deserves better than what she has gotten so far," Brennan said simply. Then his eyes found Josephine on the fence, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of shared understanding about the horse between them. McCready spat in the dust and turned away, and the other cowboys began to disperse, apparently done with their entertainment for the day. Josephine knew she should leave as well, but her feet would not carry her away from the corral. The sorrel mare fascinated her, and now this man who had spoken up for the animal intrigued her as well. "You have a good eye for horses," Brennan said, directing his words to her as he reached the fence. "So do you," Josephine replied, meeting his gaze directly in a way that made some men uncomfortable. He did not look away. "That mare needs patience, not force," he continued. "Someone who understands that breaking does not have to mean destroying. Someone like you." The question came out more challenging than Josephine had intended, but Brennan just smiled slightly, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her pulse quicken. "Someone like you, I think," he said. "I saw the way you were watching her. You were not seeing a problem to solve. You were seeing her." Josephine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Before she could formulate a response, her father cleared his throat behind her, and she remembered herself. "I should go," she said quickly. "We are leaving tomorrow morning." "Where are you headed?" Brennan asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested the answer mattered to him. "Phoenix, then back up to Prescott," Thomas answered when Josephine hesitated. "Making the freight rounds." Brennan nodded slowly, his eyes still on Josephine. "Safe travels then." As she walked away with her father, Josephine could feel his gaze on her back, and she knew without looking that the sorrel mare was watching her go as well. Something had shifted in those few minutes by the corral. Some change she could not quite name but felt deep in her bones. That night, camped near the river with her father snoring softly in his bedroll, Josephine lay awake and thought about wild things and the people who understood them. She thought about dark eyes and quiet voices, about the way Brennan had looked at her as though she was not strange or difficult but simply herself. The feeling was unfamiliar enough to keep her wakeful long into the night. When dawn broke over the Verde River Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Josephine rose and went through the familiar motions of breaking camp. Her father was already hitching the team, and she moved to help him, but her mind kept drifting back to the corral and the sorrel mare and the man who had defended her. "You are distracted this morning," Thomas observed as they secured the last of the load. "Just thinking," Josephine said, not quite lying, "about that horse or that cowboy." She shot her father a sharp look, but he was smiling gently, and she felt her defenses soften. "Both, I suppose. He seemed like a decent sort," Thomas said carefully, "the kind of man who thinks before he acts." "We are leaving in an hour, so it hardly matters what kind of man he is," Josephine replied, more sharply than she intended. The truth was that it did matter somehow, and that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. They were loading the last crate when hoofbeats approached, and Josephine turned to see Brennan riding toward their camp on a sturdy bay gelding. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, and she had to remind herself to breathe normally. "Morning," Brennan said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Thomas said before Josephine could speak. "What brings you out this way?" Brennan swung down from his horse with an easy grace. "I wanted to ask Miss Harper something before you left, if she would not mind." Every particle of Josephine's attention focused on him. "Ask me what? Would you be willing to try working with that sorrel mare?" The question came out in a rush, as though he had been rehearsing it. "The ranch owner, Mr. Dalton Irving, said this morning that if no one could break her by tonight, he was going to sell her to the army for whatever they wanted to do with her. I know you are leaving, but I thought maybe, if you had time, you might be able to reach her in a way none of us have." Josephine stared at him. "You want me to break a horse that 14 cowboys could not manage? I want you to show her that not everyone will hurt her," Brennan said quietly, and there was such earnestness in his face that Josephine felt something crack open inside her chest. I saw how you watched her yesterday. You understood her, and I think she might understand you too if you gave her the chance. We need to be on the road, Thomas started to say, but Josephine interrupted him. How long would I have? If you started now, maybe 6 hours before we would have to give an answer to Mr. Irving, Brennan said. I know it is not much time, but it is all there is. Josephine looked at her father, a question in her eyes. Thomas sighed, but he was smiling slightly. I suppose Phoenix can wait a few more hours. The supplies will keep. Relief and anticipation flooded through Josephine in equal measure. Then I will try. The walk back to the ranch corral felt longer than it was, with Brennan leading his bay and Josephine walking beside him. Thomas had stayed with the wagon, giving them privacy that felt both generous and terrifying. Josephine found herself acutely aware of every detail. The way Brennan's sleeves were rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, the sound of his boots in the dirt, the careful distance he maintained between them as they walked. "Why did you come to ask me?" she said finally, breaking the silence. Brennan glanced at her. "Because you see her as something other than a problem to be solved. Most people look at difficult horses and see a challenge to their dominance. You looked at her and saw a living creature with her own reasons for fighting." "How could you possibly know that from watching me for 5 minutes?" "The same way you knew I was not like Macready and the others," Brennan said simply. "Sometimes you recognize truth quickly when you see it." They reached the corral to find the Sorrel mare standing in the far corner, her coat dull with dried sweat and dust. She raised her head as they approached, ears pinning back in warning. Josephine climbed the fence slowly, telegraphing her movements, and dropped down into the corral. The mare snorted and shifted, weighing whether to flee or fight. Josephine stood completely still, not approaching, not advancing, just being present in the space. She could feel Brennan watching from outside the fence, could sense several other ranch hands gathering to see what would happen. But she pushed all of that awareness away and focused entirely on the horse. "I know what they did to you," Josephine said softly, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. "I know how they chased you and roped you and tried to force you into submission. And I know how that feels, being told who you have to be instead of being allowed to discover it yourself." The mare's ears flicked forward slightly, just a fraction, but Josephine noticed. She took one slow step to the side, not toward the horse but parallel, reducing the direct pressure. The mare's head lowered an inch. "Nobody is going to hurt you while I am here," Josephine continued, keeping her voice low and steady. "I am not here to break you. I am here to see if maybe we can understand each other." Another step, another slight shift in position. The mare watched her with large, intelligent eyes, and Josephine could see the war happening behind them. Instinct demanding flight, curiosity suggesting she wait and see what this two-legged creature wanted. Time became fluid in the corral. Josephine moved in a slow dance around the mare, never approaching directly, always giving the animal space to choose. She talked softly, nonsense words and gentle observations, letting her voice become part of the landscape rather than a threat. The sun climbed higher, heat building in the enclosed space, and sweat began to trickle down Josephine's spine. Somewhere around the second hour, the mare took a step toward her. It was tiny, barely a shift in weight, but Josephine's heart leaped. She stood completely still, hardly breathing, and watched as the sorrel took another step, then another. The mare stretched her neck out, nostrils wide, scenting the air between them. "That is right," Josephine whispered. "Come see, I am not so frightening, am I?" The mare came close enough that Josephine could have reached out and touched her, but she kept her hands at her sides, letting the horse investigate on her own terms. She felt the warm breath against her shoulder, the gentle exploration of her scent, and then the mare stepped back again, satisfied for the moment. From the fence, Brennan watched with something like wonder on his face. The other cowboys had grown quiet, witnessing something they had not expected to see. McCready stood with his arms crossed, a scowl on his face, but even he did not speak. By the third hour, Josephine was able to walk alongside the mare without triggering flight. By the fourth, she was touching her, running her hands along the dusty coat, feeling the tension and muscle beneath. The mare trembled but did not bolt, and Josephine praised her softly, constantly, letting her know she was doing well. "I need a blanket," Josephine called out finally, not taking her eyes off the horse. "Not a saddle yet, just a blanket." Brennan appeared at the fence with a woven saddle blanket, holding it where the mare could see it. Josephine approached slowly and took it from him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent electricity up her arm, but she pushed the feeling aside and returned to the mare. Introducing the blanket took another hour. The mare spooked twice, but each time Josephine waited her out, patient and calm, until curiosity brought the horse back to investigate. Finally, blessedly, the blanket settled across the Sorrel's back and the mare stood still, sides heaving slightly but accepting. "Good girl," Josephine breathed. "Such a good, brave girl." The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its long slide toward evening. Josephine knew she had maybe 2 more hours before the deadline, before Mr. Irving would demand an answer about the mare's fate. She looked at the horse, at the blanket on her back, at the way the mare stood with less tension than she had held that morning. "I am going to try something," she called to Brennan. "If it goes wrong, do not interfere. Let me handle it." "What are you going to do?" He sounded concerned. "Show her that carrying weight does not have to hurt." Before she could second-guess herself, Josephine moved to the mare's side. She placed her hands on the horse's withers, applying gentle pressure, letting the mare feel her weight without climbing on. The sorrel shifted but held. Josephine waited, counting her breaths. Then slowly, carefully, she pulled herself up to drape across the mare's back, her body horizontal. Not sitting up, not yet. The mare exploded. She bucked and twisted, and Josephine clung to the blanket and mane with desperate fingers, her body bouncing against the horse's spine. Every impact drove the air from her lungs, and she could hear shouting from the fence, but she focused everything on staying with the mare, on not falling, on showing the animal that she would not give up. Then, as suddenly as it started, the bucking stopped. The mare stood trembling, sides heaving, and Josephine lay across her back like a sack of grain, gasping for air. Slowly, infinitely carefully, she slid to the ground. "Easy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Easy now. That was hard, I know, that was so hard." The mare turned her head and looked at Josephine with one large eye, and something in that gaze had changed. The wildness was still there, the spirit remained, but the terror had dimmed. They had survived something together, and the mare knew it. Josephine spent the next hour repeating the process, draping herself across the mare's back and simply staying there, letting the horse grow accustomed to the weight and presence of a rider without the violence that had come before. When she finally slid off for the last time, her entire body ached, her arms trembled with exhaustion, but her heart sang with triumph. "I need help," she called to the fence. "I need someone to bring me that saddle very slowly." Brennan came into the corral with the saddle, moving with the same deliberate care Josephine had shown all day. Together they approached the mare, who watched them with wary but no longer panicked eyes. The saddle introduction went better than Josephine had dared hope. The mare shied once but allowed them to complete the process, and when the cinch was tightened and the stirrups hung properly, the sorrel simply stood there, breathing hard but accepting. Now comes the real test, Josephine said quietly. She was so tired she felt disconnected from her body, running purely on will and determination. Now I ride. You do not have to, Brennan said, his voice low and urgent. You have done enough. Mr. Irving will see that she can be worked with now. She needs to know it is possible, Josephine replied. She needs to know that being ridden does not mean being destroyed. Before Brennan could argue further, before she could lose her nerve, Josephine put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. The mare went rigid beneath her, every muscle taut as wire. Josephine sat as lightly as she could, her hands gentle on the reins, her legs barely touching the horse's sides. She waited, counting her racing heartbeats, and then the mare took one step forward, then another, then another. They walked across the corral like that, slowly, carefully, the mare testing each step as though walking on ice. Josephine guided her with the lightest pressure, turning her in wide circles, asking nothing more than acceptance and forward movement. By the time they completed their second circuit of the space, the mare's gait had smoothed, and something like wonder had replaced the terror. When Josephine finally dismounted, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Brennan was there instantly, his hands steadying her, and she leaned into his support without thinking. The touch felt right in a way that made her breath catch. That was the most incredible thing I have ever seen, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Josephine looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the way his hands remained on her arms even though she had steadied herself. She just needed someone to listen. So do most creatures, Brennan replied, and his eyes were searching her face as though memorizing every detail. The moment broke when Mr. Irving came striding into view, followed by several ranch hands. The ranch owner was a stocky man in his 50s with a florid face and sharp eyes. He looked at the mare, at Josephine, at Brennan standing close enough to her that propriety might object. Well, I will be damned, Irving said slowly. Brennan said you might manage it, but I did not believe him. That mare looks like a different animal. She is the same animal, Josephine said, finding her voice despite her exhaustion. She just needed different treatment. Irving studied her for a long moment. You looking for work? I could use someone with your touch around horses. The offer hung in the air between them. Josephine felt her father's presence before she saw him, Thomas having come to check on her when the time had stretched so long. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. That is Josephine's decision to make, Thomas said quietly. She is grown and she knows her own mind. But Josephine was not looking at her father or at Mr. Irving anymore. She was looking at Brennan, at the hope naked on his face, and she felt her heart make a decision her head had not quite caught up to yet. I would need to help my father complete this freight run first, she heard herself say. But after that, if the offer still stands, I would like to work with your horses. Irving nodded sharply. It will stand. Brennan, that mare is your project now. Work with Miss Harper here when she returns to get her properly trained. He turned and walked away, the other hands dispersing with him, leaving Josephine and Brennan alone except for Thomas standing a respectful distance away. You are coming back, Brennan said, and it was not quite a question but not quite a statement either. I am coming back, Josephine confirmed and felt the rightness of the decision settle into her bones. That evening, as she and Thomas made camp outside Fort McDowell for one more night before their morning departure, Josephine could not stop replaying the day in her mind. Every moment seemed etched in crystal clarity. The mare's gradual trust, the ache in her muscles from the bucking, the look on Brennan's face when she had agreed to return. You are thinking about him, Thomas said as they sat by their small fire. Is it that obvious? Her father smiled. To me, yes. You have that look your mother used to get, like you are seeing something the rest of us cannot quite make out yet. Josephine's throat tightened at the mention of her mother, who had died of influenza 5 years prior. What if I am making a mistake? Then you will learn from it, Thomas said simply. But I do not think you are. That young man looked at you the way I used to look at your mother, like you were the only real thing in a world full of shadows. Sleep came easier that night, and when dawn broke, Josephine and her father began the journey to Phoenix with lighter hearts. The freight run took them through familiar territory, the dusty roads, the scattered ranches, the small settlements clinging to existence in the harsh Arizona landscape. They made their deliveries, picked up new goods, and turned north toward Prescott. The days blurred together in the way of long travel, but Josephine's mind remained partially back at Fort McDowell, wondering about the Sorrel mare and the quiet cowboy who had asked for her help. She caught herself daydreaming, imagining conversations they might have, moments they might share, and she felt both foolish and hopeful in equal measure. Prescott was cooler than the lower elevations, situated in the mountains where ponderosa pines replaced the scrub and cactus. They completed their business there efficiently, and 3 weeks after leaving Fort McDowell, they were heading back south with an empty wagon and the promise of return. Josephine's heart beat faster as they approached the Verde River Valley. She had changed into her best shirt that morning, had taken extra care with her hair, and Thomas had said nothing, but she had seen his knowing smile. When the ranch buildings came into view, she had to remind herself to breathe normally. Brennan was working in the corral when they arrived, and Josephine's breath caught at the sight of him. He looked up at the sound of their wagon, and the smile that broke across his face made her feel warm from her chest to her fingertips. "You came back," he said, striding over to meet them. "I said I would." Josephine climbed down from the wagon, suddenly aware of the dust on her clothes and the sun on her face. "How is the mare?" she asked. "See for yourself." Brennan gestured toward the corral, and Josephine saw the sorrel standing calmly in the shade, her coat gleaming copper in the dappled light. The horse raised her head at Josephine's approach and walked over to the fence, nickering softly. "Hello, beautiful," Josephine whispered, reaching out to stroke the soft nose. The mare leaned into her touch, and Josephine felt tears prick her eyes at the transformation. "You remember me." "She has been watching for you," Brennan said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Every wagon that passed, she would look up like she was hoping it might be you. Josephine glanced at him. "Just the horse." The question was bold, forward in a way that women were not supposed to be, but Josephine had never been good at following those rules. Brennan met her eyes, and she saw the truth there before he spoke it. "Not just the horse," he admitted. "I have been watching too." Thomas cleared his throat somewhere behind them, and Josephine remembered that they were not alone, that there were proprieties to observe even if her heart wanted to ignore them all. She stepped back from the fence, trying to compose herself. "Mr. Irving said I should report to him when I arrived," she said, forcing practicality into her voice. "He is up at the main house," Brennan replied. "I can show you the way if you would like." They walked together through the ranch yard, past the barns and equipment sheds, toward the large adobe house that served as Irving's residence. Josephine was aware of curious eyes watching them, of ranch hands pausing in their work to observe the woman who had tamed the untamable mare. Irving met them on the wide porch, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Miss Harper, welcome back. Your father's staying on." "He needs to return to Prescott for another haul," Josephine said, "but he will be back through in a few weeks." Irving nodded. "We have a bunkhouse for the hands, but it is not appropriate for a woman. There is a small cabin near the river that one of the ranch families used to occupy. It needs some work, but it is private and secure." "That suit you," The offer was more than fair, more than Josephine had expected. "That would be perfect, thank you." "Brennan, help her get settled," Irving said. "Then tomorrow we will discuss her duties and expectations." The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area separated by a curtain, and a table with 2 chairs. It was dusty from disuse, but Josephine could see its potential. She spent the rest of that day cleaning while Brennan brought water from the river, and Thomas checked the roof for leaks and made small repairs. As evening approached and it came time for Thomas to leave, Josephine felt a lump form in her throat. She had traveled with her father for years, and this separation felt significant in a way previous partings had not. "You will be all right," Thomas said, holding her shoulders and looking into her eyes. "You are strong and capable, and I think you have found something here worth staying for." "I love you," Josephine whispered, hugging him tightly. "I love you too, daughter. I will be back through in 3 weeks. If you need anything before then, send word to Prescott and I will come." She watched his wagon roll away until it disappeared from view, and then she turned to find Brennan standing a respectful distance away, waiting to make sure she was all right. "It is strange being alone," she admitted. "You are not alone," Brennan said gently. "The ranch is full of people, and I am just up in the bunkhouse if you need anything." That night, lying in the unfamiliar cabin listening to the sounds of the river and the Arizona darkness, Josephine felt both terrified and exhilarated. She had made a choice, had stepped off the path that had been her life for years, and she had done it largely because of a man she barely knew and a horse that had touched something deep inside her. Morning came early on the ranch. Josephine woke before dawn, dressed quickly, and made her way to the corral where she had arranged to meet Brennan. He was already there, of course, working with the Sorrel mare in the gray pre-dawn light. "Morning," he called softly, not wanting to startle the horse. "I thought we could work together today, see how she does with both of us handling her." The work was hard but satisfying. The mare responded well to Josephine's presence, and Brennan proved to be a patient and skilled horseman himself. They moved around each other in the corral with an ease that felt natural, anticipating each other's movements, wordlessly coordinating their efforts. "You have done this before," Josephine observed during a break, watching as Brennan checked the mare's hooves. "My family raised horses back in Texas," he explained. "Before the war changed everything. I grew up around them, learned to listen to what they were telling me instead of just trying to force them into submission." "Why did you leave Texas?" Something shadowed his face. "My father died in '68 and my mother the year after. There was nothing left there for me, so I drifted west. Ended up here about a year ago, and Mr. Irving gave me a chance when I needed one." Josephine heard the grief beneath his words, recognized it because she carried her own. "My mother died 5 years ago. Influenza. My father threw himself into the freight business afterward, and I threw myself in with him because it was easier than staying still." "And now?" Brennan asked, his dark eyes searching her face. "Now I think maybe I am ready to stay still for a while," Josephine said softly. "See what grows when you give it time and attention." The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Josephine worked with the horses, primarily focusing on the sorrel mare, but also helping with other animals that needed gentling. Brennan was her constant companion in this work, and their partnership deepened with each passing day. They learned each other's habits and preferences, developed a shorthand of looks and gestures, and discovered that they shared more than just a love of horses. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would often sit by the river and talk. Brennan told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents and the ranch they had built from nothing. Josephine shared stories of traveling with her father, of the places they had seen and the people they had met. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations flowing as easily as the Verd River beside them. Thomas returned after 3 weeks, as promised, and Josephine saw the approval in his eyes when he observed how she and Brennan interacted. Her father stayed 2 days before heading out again, and when he left this time, Josephine felt no uncertainty. She had made the right choice in staying. The Sorrel mare, whom Josephine had named Copper for her beautiful coat, progressed beautifully. She would now accept any rider who treated her with respect, though she remained spirited and strong-willed. Mr. Irving was so pleased with the results that he gave Josephine free rein to work with any of the horses that proved difficult. It was during one of these training sessions in early October, with the Arizona heat finally beginning to break, that everything changed. Josephine was working with a young gelding who was skittish about having his back feet handled. Brennan was across the corral with another horse, and Josephine was so focused on her work that she did not hear the riders approaching until they were already in the ranch yard. She looked up to see 6 men on horseback, all armed, all with the hard look of men who lived on the wrong side of the law. The leader was a man she recognized with a sinking feeling in her stomach, Jake McCready, the cowboy who had wanted to beat the Sorrel mare into submission. He had left the ranch a month ago after a dispute with Mr. Irving, and apparently he had found new employment that suited his temperament. "Well, look what we have here," McCready called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "The horse whisperer herself." Josephine straightened slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the knife she kept at her belt. Brennan had gone very still across the corral, his attention focused entirely on the newcomers. "What do you want, McCready?" Mr. Irving appeared from the main house, his own hand resting casually on his sidearm. "We are here for horses," McCready said. "We heard you have some fine animals and we are willing to pay a fair price." "Nothing here is for sale to you," Irving replied flatly. "You best move on." McCready's expression hardened. "That is not very neighborly, Mr. Irving. Maybe we will just take what we need." Everything happened very fast after that. McCready's men started to fan out and Irving shouted for his hands. Brennan vaulted the corral fence and ran toward Josephine, shouting at her to get down. And then gunfire erupted across the ranch yard. Josephine dropped to the ground behind the water trough, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard horses screaming, men shouting, the crack of rifles and revolvers. The gelding she had been working with panicked and fled to the far corner of the corral. Brennan reached her and pulled her further down, his body shielding hers. "Stay down," he ordered, and she could hear the fear in his voice. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, Josephine raised her head carefully and saw McCready and his men retreating at a gallop, one of them slumped in his saddle. 2 of Irving's ranch hands were down, one clearly dead and the other clutching his shoulder and groaning. Brennan helped Josephine to her feet, his hands running over her as though checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did anything hit you?" "I am fine," she gasped. "I am fine. Are you?" "I am all right." He pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly, and Josephine felt the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. "When I saw them ride in, all I could think was that I had to get to you, had to make sure you were safe." Irving was organizing men to pursue the raiders, to help the wounded, to secure the ranch. In the chaos and fear, something crystallized for Josephine. Life was fragile, moments were precious, and she was tired of pretending she did not feel what she felt. "Brennan," she said, pulling back to look up at him, "I need to tell you something." His hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Tell me." "I am falling in love with you," she said simply. "Maybe I started that first day when you defended Copper. Maybe it was when you asked me to come back. but I know it for certain now, and I am tired of not saying it." The look on his face was worth every fear, every risk. "Josephine Harper, I have been in love with you since I watched you stand in that corral and speak to a wild horse like she was worth understanding. I did not think I would ever find someone who saw the world the way I do, who understood that strength and gentleness are not opposites. Then you rode into Fort McDowell, and everything changed." He kissed her then, in the middle of the ranch yard with chaos still swirling around them, and Josephine felt like she was finally home. His lips were soft and sure, his hands careful on her face, and she leaned into him with everything she had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, Irving was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed and something that might have been amusement on his weathered face. "You two done?" he asked mildly, "because we have work to do securing this ranch." Josephine felt her face heat, but Brennan just smiled and kept one arm around her waist as they turned to face his boss. "Yes, sir. What do you need us to do?" The next hours were spent in careful preparation. Irving sent riders to Fort McDowell to alert the military about the raiders, posted guards around the ranch, and made sure all the horses were secured. The wounded ranch hand was tended to and would survive, though he would carry a scar. The dead man was prepared for burial, and a somber mood settled over the ranch. That evening, Josephine sat in her cabin and felt the full weight of what had happened crash down on her. She had come so close to losing everything, to having Brennan injured or worse, to seeing the life she was building destroyed by violence. When a soft knock came at her door, she opened it to find Brennan standing there with uncertainty in his eyes. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "Today was hard." "Come in," Josephine said, stepping aside. Propriety suggested this was improper, but she found she did not care. She needed his presence, needed to know he was real and safe in here. They sat at her small table, and Brennan reached across to take her hand. His thumb traced patterns on her palm, and the simple touch anchored her. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said today, about falling in love. Are you taking it back?" Josephine tried to keep her voice light, but fear crept in anyway. "No," Brennan said firmly. "I am saying it right back to you, and I am asking if you would consider building a life with me. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and true, and I do not want to waste time pretending otherwise." Josephine felt tears sting her eyes. "What are you asking me exactly?" "I am asking you to marry me," Brennan said, and his voice shook slightly. "I am asking you to be my wife, my partner, my best friend. I am asking you to take a chance on us." The answer came from somewhere deep and certain inside her. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face was radiant, and he stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle in the small cabin. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Josephine felt the promise in it. They were married 3 weeks later in Fort McDowell, with Thomas giving Josephine away and half the ranch in attendance. The ceremony was simple, performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through, but to Josephine it felt perfect. She wore a new dress that Thomas had brought from Prescott, simple blue calico that brought out her eyes, and Brennan wore his best clothes and looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. "I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you all our days," Brennan said during the vows, his hands steady as they held hers. "I promise to listen when you speak, to laugh with you in joy, and to hold you in sorrow. You are my heart, Josephine, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Josephine's voice was thick with emotion when she replied, "I promise to love you with everything I am, to be your partner in all things, to believe in you even when you doubt yourself. You saw me when others looked away, Brennan, and I will spend our life together making sure you always feel that seen and valued in return." When the preacher pronounced them married and Brennan kissed her, Josephine heard Copper whinny from a nearby corral, as though the mare was celebrating with them. Everyone laughed, and the moment was perfect and imperfect and utterly real. Mr. Irving had given them the cabin by the river as a wedding gift, along with a raise in pay and a promise that they would always have a place on his ranch. Thomas stayed for a week after the wedding, getting to know his new son-in-law better, and when he finally left, he held Josephine close and whispered that her mother would have loved Brennan. Married life suited them both. They fell into partnership easily, working together with the horses during the day and retreating to their cabin in the evenings. Brennan proved to be a thoughtful husband, attentive and affectionate, and Josephine found herself grateful every day that she had taken the risk of staying. The winter of 1876 was mild in Arizona, and Josephine and Brennan spent it building their life together. They took on more responsibilities at the ranch, with Brennan becoming Irving's right-hand man, and Josephine developing a reputation as the best horse trainer in the territory. People started bringing difficult animals from as far as Phoenix and Prescott, and Josephine worked with each one with the same patience and understanding she had shown Copper. Spring brought new foals and renewed energy to the ranch. Josephine discovered in April that she was pregnant, and the joy on Brennan's face when she told him made her heart overflow. He became even more protective, fussing over her in ways that were endearing even when they were excessive. "I am not made of glass," she protested one day when he tried to stop her from working with a particularly stubborn mare. "I know that," Brennan replied, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "But you are carrying something precious, and I will not apologize for wanting to keep you both safe." Josephine softened, covering his hand with hers. "We are both fine, and I need to keep working, Brennan. I will go mad if you make me sit idle for 6 months." They compromised, with Josephine taking on less demanding work, and Brennan hovering nearby whenever she was in the corrals. Thomas came through regularly on his freight runs, bringing supplies and checking on his daughter, and his delight at the prospect of becoming a grandfather was palpable. Summer arrived with its usual intensity, and Josephine grew round with the baby. She worked up until the last few weeks, unable to completely give up the horses that had brought her such joy. Brennan built a cradle in their cabin during the long evenings, his hands careful as he sanded and shaped the wood. Their son was born in late September 1877, arriving in the early morning hours with the stubborn determination that would mark his character. Brennan held Josephine's hand through the difficult labor, and when the midwife finally placed the baby in her arms, Josephine looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "What should we name him?" she asked Brennan, who was staring at their son with wonder written across his face. "I was thinking Thomas after your father," Brennan suggested, "if that would please you." Tears stung Josephine's eyes. "That would please me very much." Thomas Harper Irving arrived to meet his namesake 3 days later, and the sight of her gruff father holding the tiny baby with such gentleness made Josephine cry yet again. Everything felt tender and overwhelming in those first weeks, but Brennan was steadfast, rising in the night with her, changing diapers and learning to soothe the baby's cries. The ranch hands treated young Thomas like a collective nephew, with even the gruffest cowboys stopping by the cabin to bring small gifts or offer awkward congratulations. Mr. Irving reduced Josephine and Brennan's duties, giving them time to adjust to parenthood, and the entire ranch seemed to embrace the new addition. Josephine returned to working with horses gradually as Thomas grew, and she found that motherhood had not diminished her skill. If anything, the patience required for a baby translated well to working with difficult animals. She would strap Thomas to her back in a carrier and work in the corrals, the baby watching the horses with wide, fascinated eyes. "He is going to be a horseman like his parents," Brennan observed one day, watching as 10-month-old Thomas reached out to touch Copper's soft nose. "Or he will decide horses are boring and become a banker," Josephine replied with a smile. "Either way, as long as he is happy." The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler who indeed seemed to have an affinity for horses. In 1879, Josephine gave birth to their daughter, whom they named Claire after Brennan's mother. She arrived in spring when the desert was blooming, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. The ranch prospered under Irving's management, and Brennan's role expanded until he was effectively running the day-to-day operations. Josephine's reputation continued to grow, and she was sought after not just for difficult horses, but to teach others her methods. She held informal classes in the corral, passing on what she knew to anyone willing to learn with patience instead of force. Fort McDowell itself grew and changed, the military presence expanding and the settlement around it becoming more established. The wildness of the territory was slowly being tamed, though echoes of that earlier, rougher time remained. McCready and his gang were eventually caught and hanged for their crimes, bringing a sense of closure to that frightening day when Josephine and Brennan had first admitted their feelings. In 1882, when Thomas was 5 and Claire was 3, Mr. Irving called Brennan and Josephine to the main house for a conversation that would change their lives again. He was aging, his movements slower, his energy diminished, and he had no children of his own to inherit the ranch. "I want you two to take over," he said without preamble. "I will stay on and help as long as I am able, but the ranch should pass to people who understand it, who care about the land and the animals. You have both proven yourselves 100 times over. Say you will do it." Josephine and Brennan looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Then Brennan turned back to Irving and extended his hand. "It would be an honor, sir." The transition happened gradually over the next year, with Irving teaching them the business side of ranching and introducing them to his contacts and associates. It was hard work, often overwhelming, but Josephine and Brennan met each challenge as they met everything else, together. Mr. Irving passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1883, and Josephine and Brennan mourned him genuinely. He had given them both a chance when they needed one, had recognized their worth and their partnership, and had trusted them with his life's work. They vowed to honor his memory by running the ranch with the same integrity he had shown. As the owners of the Irving Ranch, their responsibilities increased dramatically, but so did their satisfaction. Brennan proved to be an excellent manager, fair with the hands and shrewd in business dealings. Josephine continued to work with the horses while also managing the household and raising their growing children. In 1885, they welcomed another son, whom they named Benjamin after Brennan's father. The cabin by the river had long since been expanded to accommodate their growing family, with additional rooms and a proper kitchen. It was comfortable without being grand, a home filled with love and laughter and the organized chaos of children. Thomas, now 8, was already helping in the barns, mimicking his father's patient way with the animals. Claire was fearless and curious, climbing everything she could reach, and baby Benjamin was a cheerful soul who smiled at everyone. One evening in late 1885, after the children were finally asleep, Josephine and Brennan sat on their porch watching the stars emerge over the Arizona landscape. Nearly 10 years had passed since that day when she had ridden the Sorrel mare past 14 silent cowboys, and sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. "You ever regret it?" Brennan asked softly. "Giving up the traveling life with your father, staying here with me?" Josephine turned to look at her husband, seeing the gray starting to thread through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was still the man who had seen her, who had understood the Sorrel mare's spirit and her own, and her love for him had only deepened with time. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "You gave me a home, Brennan, not just a place, but a real home where I belong." He pulled her close, and she settled against his side with the ease of long practice. "You gave me the same thing. Before you, I was just drifting. You gave me purpose." "We gave each other purpose," Josephine corrected softly. Thomas came through regularly, now semi-retired from the freight business and spending more time with his grandchildren. He had aged considerably in the past decade, his hair completely white, his movements careful, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for his family was unwavering. He would sit with young Thomas and tell stories of the old days, of traveling across the territory with Josephine when she was young. The territory itself was changing rapidly. The railroad had reached Arizona, bringing more settlers and accelerating development. The wildness that had characterized the 1870s was fading, replaced by something more civilized but perhaps less free. Josephine sometimes felt nostalgic for those earlier days, but she also appreciated the stability and security that progress brought. In 1887, tragedy struck when Thomas Harper suffered a stroke while visiting the ranch. He lingered for 3 days, with Josephine at his bedside constantly, before passing away peacefully with his daughter holding his hand. She was devastated by the loss, her grief profound and encompassing. Brennan held her through the worst of it, letting her cry against his chest for hours, and their children were gentle and quiet, sensing their mother's pain even if they did not fully understand it. They buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone marking his resting place. Josephine visited the grave regularly in the months that followed, talking to her father about the children, about the horses, about how much she missed him. Brennan worried about her in those dark months, but gradually the acute pain of grief softened into something more bearable, a permanent ache rather than a consuming fire. Work helped. The ranch demanded constant attention, and Josephine threw herself into training horses and managing the household. Young Thomas, now 10, took on more responsibilities, proving himself capable and trustworthy beyond his years. Claire, at 8, was developing into an excellent rider with none of her mother's initial hesitation around horses. And Benjamin, at 2, was a constant source of joy, his innocent happiness, a balm to Josephine's grieving heart. In 1889, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that she was now 36 years old. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, and Brennan hovered anxiously, remembering how they had lost 2 babies between Claire and Benjamin to early miscarriages. But this baby proved tenacious, and in early 1890 their daughter Grace was born, small but healthy and with a surprisingly loud cry. "Our last one," Josephine said to Brennan as they looked down at the baby sleeping in her cradle. "I am too old for more children." "You are perfect," Brennan corrected, kissing her temple. "And Grace is perfect. Our family is complete." The 1890s brought continued change to Arizona. Statehood was being discussed seriously, and the territory was becoming more connected to the rest of the nation. The Irving Ranch prospered under Josephine and Brennan's management. earning a reputation for quality horses and ethical treatment of both animals and workers. They employed over 20 men full-time, with additional seasonal help during busy periods. Young Thomas had grown into a serious young man who had his father's quiet confidence and his mother's intuition with horses. At 16, he was already being groomed to eventually take over the ranch, though both Josephine and Brennan were careful not to pressure him into a path he might not want. Claire, at 14, was fiery and independent, already declaring that she wanted to be a horse trainer like her mother. Benjamin, at 7, was the dreamer of the family, more interested in books and drawing than ranch work, which his parents supported even as some of the hands quietly disapproved. And little Grace, at 3, was the baby of the family, adored by everyone and showing early signs of being spoiled by her older siblings. Copper, the Sorrel mare who had started everything, was now old and retired, living out her days in a special pasture near the house where she could watch the comings and goings of ranch life. Josephine visited her daily, bringing treats and spending time grooming the mare who had changed her life. The horse was gray around her muzzle now, her movements slower, but her spirit remained bright. One morning in late 1893, Josephine went to visit Copper and found the mare had passed away during the night, lying peacefully in the grass, as though she had simply gone to sleep. Josephine sat down beside the body and wept, grieving not just for the horse, but for everything she represented. Youth and possibility, the beginning of the life Josephine had built with Brennan, the moment when everything had changed. They buried Copper on the same hill as Thomas Harper, with a marker noting her as the foundation mare of the Irving Ranch. The entire ranch attended the burial, which some might have thought excessive for a horse, but Josephine did not care. Copper had been more than a horse. She had been the bridge between Josephine's old life and her new one, and she deserved to be honored. That evening, Josephine and Brennan lay in bed together, her head on his chest, his fingers stroking through her hair. They were in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, with the bulk of their lives lived but still good years ahead. "I was thinking today about that first time I saw you," Josephine said softly. "Standing by the corral, defending Copper when no one else would. Did you know then that I would be important to you?" "I hoped," Brennan admitted. "I saw you standing there watching her, and I thought this woman understands something the rest of us are missing. And then you looked at me, and I felt like you could see right through me, all the parts I tried to keep hidden, and you were not frightened by what you saw." "I saw someone kind," Josephine said, "someone who valued compassion over dominance. In a place and time where that is rare, especially in men, it made you extraordinary." "You made me better," Brennan said. "Knowing you, loving you, building this life with you, it brought out parts of me I did not know existed. You gave me permission to be gentle in a world that told me gentleness was weakness." They held each other in the darkness, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something lasting. Outside, the Arizona night settled over their ranch, over the horses sleeping in their barns, over their children dreaming in their beds. It was an ordinary evening and an extraordinary one, the kind of moment that makes up a life. The turn of the century came, and with it a sense of new beginnings. Young Thomas, now 23, married a teacher from Fort McDowell named Sarah, a sensible woman with a quick smile who fit seamlessly into the ranch family. Claire, at 21, showed no interest in marriage yet, preferring to work with her mother training horses and declaring that no man would ever be as interesting as a good horse. Benjamin, at 17, was preparing to attend university in California, much to the surprise of many who could not imagine why anyone would leave a successful ranch. And Grace, at 10, was still young enough to exist in that magical space between childhood and adolescence. Josephine and Brennan were in their late 40s now, their hair liberally streaked with gray, their bodies carrying the marks of decades of hard work. But they were healthy and content, surrounded by family and engaged in work they loved. The ranch continued to prosper, and their reputation extended far beyond Arizona territory. In 1902, Thomas and Sarah had their first child, a boy they named Brennan Thomas Irving after both grandfathers. Josephine held her first grandchild and felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both poignant and joyful. Brennan, seeing his wife with their grandchild, was reminded of the first time he had watched her hold their own babies, and his love for her swelled until he thought his chest might burst with it. "We did well," he said that evening, finding Josephine sitting on their porch watching the sunset. "All those years ago, when we took a chance on each other, we could not have known it would lead to all this." Josephine reached for his hand, their fingers interlocking automatically. "I knew," she said quietly. "Maybe not the details, but I knew that choosing you was choosing a life worth living. I have never doubted that decision." Claire surprised them all in 1903 by falling in love with a veterinarian who had come to the ranch to treat one of their horses. Dr. Marcus Webb was a quiet man in his late 20s, dedicated to his work and gentle with animals. He reminded Josephine very much of Brennan in his younger days, and she gave her blessing gladly when Marcus asked permission to court Claire. They married in a simple ceremony at the ranch in early 1904, and Marcus joined the ranch staff, tending to all the animals and working alongside his wife. Benjamin graduated from university in 1905 with a degree in engineering, but rather than taking a job in one of the growing cities, he surprised everyone by returning to the ranch. He had ideas about modernizing certain aspects of their operations, about bringing new efficiency without losing the personal touch that had made them successful. Brennan and Josephine listened to his proposals and implemented many of them, proud of their son's education and grateful that he chose to bring his knowledge home. Grace, growing into a beautiful young woman, proved to have a gift for the business side of ranching. At 15, she was already helping manage the accounts and correspondence, her neat handwriting and head for numbers making her invaluable. Josephine and Brennan joked that between their 4 children, every aspect of the ranch was covered. Thomas with his management skills, Claire with her horse expertise, Benjamin with his modernization ideas, and Grace with her business acumen. As Arizona moved closer to statehood, which would finally come in 1912, the Irving Ranch stood as an example of what could be built with hard work, integrity, and partnership. Josephine and Brennan were respected throughout the territory, sought out for advice on everything from horse training to land management to how to build a successful marriage. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1906, Josephine was 53 and Brennan was 55. Their children threw them a party at the ranch, with neighbors and friends traveling from across the territory to celebrate. As Josephine looked around at the gathering, at the life they had built, she felt overwhelming gratitude. That evening, after the guests had departed and the ranch had settled into quiet, Josephine and Brennan walked down to the river where their journey had begun. The cabin they had first shared had been expanded and modernized, but the river flowed just as it always had, constant and eternal. "Do you remember our wedding night?" Brennan asked, his arm around her waist. "We sat right here and talked until dawn about all our hopes and dreams." "I remember," Josephine said softly. "We were so young, we had no idea what we were building. Would you do it all again? If you could go back, knowing everything that was coming, would you still say yes?" Josephine turned to face her husband fully, this man who had been her partner for 30 years, who had stood beside her through joy and grief, triumph and challenge. His face was lined now, his body not as strong as it once was, but his eyes held the same kindness and intelligence that had drawn her to him in the beginning. "I would say yes 1,000 times," she said firmly. "Every hardship, every loss, every difficult moment was worth it for us, for the family we built and the life we have shared. You are the best decision I ever made, Brennan Irving." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Josephine felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt at 23 when he first told her he loved her. Some things, she realized, did not diminish with time. Some things only grew stronger. The years continued their steady march. Young Brennan Thomas grew into a sturdy child who loved the horses as much as his grandmother. Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, daughters named Elizabeth and Anne. Claire and Marcus had twin boys in 1907, to everyone's delighted surprise. Benjamin married a woman he had met at university, bringing her home to the ranch where she proved to be a perfect match for his quiet intellect. And Grace, at 19, was being courted by a banker's son from Phoenix, much to her siblings' teasing. Josephine and Brennan gradually reduced their direct involvement in the ranch's daily operations, transitioning responsibility to young Thomas while remaining available for advice and guidance. They took pleasure in their grandchildren, in the changes sweeping across Arizona, in the quiet satisfaction of work well done. In 1910, Josephine woke one morning to find Brennan still sleeping beside her, which was unusual since he normally rose before dawn. She touched his shoulder gently, and when he did not respond immediately, a moment of pure terror gripped her. Then his eyes opened and he smiled at her and she could breathe again. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hand on his cheek. "Just tired," he said, and she could hear it in his voice. "I think I will rest a bit longer this morning." It was the beginning of his decline, though neither of them recognized it at first. Over the following months, Brennan's energy diminished gradually. He would tire easily, need more rest, move more slowly. The doctor from Fort McDowell could find nothing specifically wrong, but he pulled Josephine aside and told her gently that sometimes bodies simply began to wear out, that Brennan had lived a hard life of physical labor, and it was taking its toll. Josephine refused to accept that her husband was simply fading. She made him rest, prepared nutritious meals, limited his work to only what he could manage easily. Brennan tolerated her fussing with patient amusement, telling her she was worrying unnecessarily, but Josephine could see the truth in his increasing frailty. Christmas of 1910 was bittersweet. The entire family gathered at the ranch, and Brennan held court from his chair by the fireplace, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Josephine watched him interact with their family and felt her heart clench with love and fear in equal measure. He was 60 years old, which was not impossibly ancient, but she could see him slipping away day by day. That night, lying beside him in their bed, she voiced her deepest fear. "You are leaving me." "Not if I can help it," Brennan said, his voice weak but determined. "I am not ready to go, Josephine. We have more living to do." But by spring of 1911, it was clear that determination was not enough. Brennan was confined to bed more often than not, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp. The family took turns sitting with him, and Josephine rarely left his side. They talked about everything and nothing, remembering their years together, laughing over old stories, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. On a warm May afternoon, with the windows open to let in the Arizona breeze, Brennan took Josephine's hand and looked at her with the same intensity he had shown on their wedding day. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Loving you was the greatest adventure of my life. Every day with you was a gift. If I have any regrets, it is only that we did not have more time. Tears streamed down Josephine's face. We had 35 years. We built a life, a family, a legacy. That is more than many people ever get. Promise me you will keep living, Brennan said urgently. Do not lock yourself away in grief. Keep working with the horses, keep loving our family, keep being the extraordinary woman I fell in love with. I promise, Josephine whispered, though she could not imagine how she would fulfill that promise without him. Brennan passed away that evening with Josephine holding his hand, and their children gathered around his bed. His death was peaceful, a simple cessation of breath, and Josephine felt the moment his spirit left as though part of her own soul had departed with him. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across Arizona territory. Brennan had touched many lives through his kindness, his integrity, his skill with horses and people alike. They buried him on the hill beside Thomas Harper and Copper, the three souls who had meant the most to Josephine, laid to rest together, overlooking the land they had all loved. The months after Brennan's death were the darkest of Josephine's life. She was 58 years old, and the future stretched before her empty and meaningless without her partner. She went through the motions of living because she had promised Brennan she would, but there was no joy in it. Her children worried about her, but nothing they said or did could penetrate the fog of her grief. It was Grace, surprisingly, who finally reached her. The youngest daughter, now 21 and engaged to be married, came to find Josephine sitting by the river one evening in late summer. "Mother, I need to talk to you," Grace said, sitting down beside her. "I need to tell you something, but I am afraid it will upset you." Josephine roused herself enough to look at her daughter. "What is it?" "I am getting married in October, and I want you to be there, to be present and happy, not just physically in attendance but emotionally engaged. And I cannot do that if you are still drowning in grief." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "Daddy would not want this for you. He made you promise to keep living, and you are not keeping that promise." The words struck Josephine like a physical blow, and she felt anger flash through her for the first time since Brennan's death. "How dare you suggest I am not honoring your father's wishes?" "Because you are not," Grace said calmly. "You are honoring his death but not his life. Daddy loved watching you work with horses. He loved seeing you laugh with your grandchildren. He loved the fierce, independent woman you were. If you spend the rest of your life as a shadow of yourself, you are not honoring his memory. You are abandoning everything he loved about you." Josephine opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She looked at her youngest child, at the strength and wisdom in her young face, and realized Grace was right. Brennan would be furious to see her wasting away like this. He would want her to live fully, to embrace the time she had left, to continue the work they had built together. "I do not know if I can," she whispered finally. "It hurts so much." "I know," Grace said, taking her mother's hand, "but you can carry the hurt and still live. Daddy did that after his parents died. You did that after grandfather passed away. You know how to do this, Mother. You just have to choose to do it." That conversation marked a turning point. Josephine began to slowly emerge from her grief, returning to the work she loved. She started training horses again, tentatively at first, but with growing confidence. She engaged with her grandchildren, attended Grace's wedding in October with genuine happiness, and gradually found her way back to living rather than simply existing. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Josephine was there to see it, standing with her family as the new state flag was raised. She felt Brennan's absence keenly, wished desperately that he could have witnessed this moment they had both anticipated, but she also felt his presence in spirit. He would have been proud to see their state officially recognized, to know that the wildness he had loved was being preserved even as civilization advanced. The Irving Ranch continued to prosper under young Thomas's management, with Josephine serving as an advisor and mentor. She trained horses until she was well into her 60s, only gradually reducing her involvement as her body demanded rest. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love, making sure she never felt alone even as she learned to live without her partner. In 1920, at the age of 67, Josephine was honored by the Arizona Cattlemen's Association for her contributions to horse breeding and training in the state. She accepted the award with grace, acknowledging that every success she had achieved had been built on the foundation of partnership with Brennan. Her speech moved many in the audience to tears, and afterward, several young women approached her to say that she had inspired them to pursue their own unconventional paths. Josephine lived to see the 1920s bring dramatic changes to Arizona and the nation. She saw automobiles become common, saw the world connected by telephone and telegraph, saw women finally gain the right to vote. She became a grandmother many times over, and then a great-grandmother, her family tree spreading wide and strong. In her final years, Josephine would often sit on the porch of the house by the river and think about that day in 1876 when she had climbed into the corral with a wild sorrel mare. She thought about the 14 cowboys who had watched her ride, past them after she had succeeded, not one of them saying a word because they recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary. She thought about Brennan stepping forward to speak to her, to see her, to understand her in a way no one else ever had. Her life had been full and rich, marked by love and loss, triumph and challenge. She had raised 4 children who had become good, capable adults. She had helped build a ranch that stood as a testament to ethical treatment of animals and fair treatment of workers. She had been a pioneer in her field, a woman who had carved out space for herself in a man's world through skill and determination. But most importantly, she had loved and been loved in return. She had found her partner, her equal, her best friend, and they had built a life together that had meaning and purpose. The Sorrel mare had been the catalyst, but Brennan had been the destination, and the journey between them had been the adventure of her lifetime. Josephine Harper Irving passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1925, at the age of 72. She was buried on the hill beside Brennan, their graves side by side overlooking the ranch they had built together. The funeral was attended by hundreds, including 3 generations of her descendants, and the stories told about her that day painted a picture of a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply. The Irving Ranch continued under the management of her descendants, carrying forward the traditions and values she and Brennan had established. The reputation they had built for ethical treatment of horses and fair dealing in business remained the foundation of the ranch's operations. And every new generation heard the story of how their great-grandmother had ridden an unbroken sorrel mare past 14 silent cowboys, and how that single act of courage and compassion had changed everything. In the end, Josephine's legacy was not just the ranch or the training methods or the family she had raised. It was the example she had set, that women could be strong and gentle, that kindness was not weakness, that partnership between equals could create something lasting and beautiful. She had lived in a time of great change, had navigated between the wild frontier and modern civilization, and she had done it all with integrity and grace. The sorrel mare, the 14 cowboys, the quiet man who had seen her worth, a love that had sustained her through decades, children and grandchildren carrying her spirit forward into the future. It was a good life, a full life, a life well lived. And if spirits could speak, Brennan would have told her that she had kept her promise, that she had lived fully even after he was gone, and that he had been waiting for her on that hill, ready to ride beside her once more into whatever adventure came next.